And as this is my second time hosting, thank you in advance for bearing with me as we work through this evening together. So I'd like to welcome you all, whether you're joining us from Adelaide, Sydney, Queensland, or Western Australia, or anywhere around the world. We hope you're all safe and doing well. Before we begin, just a little housekeeping. All webinars for this course are held at 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, and recordings are made available for anyone unable to attend live. So that said, if you can make it, we encourage you to join us in real time and contribute to the collaborative learning environment. So as you can see, we can use our Zoom or use Zoom for our webinars. And we encourage questions and interactions through the sessions, so please direct all course content questions to the QA section and any administrative questions such as dates and times or resource availability to the support team via the chat. You can also choose to chat either with the panelists only or with all attendees by selecting the appropriate option from the drop-down menu in the chat window. We're fortunate to have many, obviously, experienced industry professionals attending these sessions, so they're often incredibly helpful with the technical questions and discussions. So we'll hold dedicated QA sessions at the end of the webinar, although if a question is particularly relevant, I may jump in during George's presentation to raise it. For those who are new to our short courses, IT Masters is a training organization that partners with Charles Sturt University to create and deliver a range of postgraduate programs. So we also market these courses on their behalf, and we believe one of the best ways to do it is by offering opportunities like this, free courses. And if we do our job well, hopefully some of you may choose to continue into the full master's program in the near future. So most importantly, we want this course to be useful, rewarding, and enjoyable. So we hope you learn some interesting new concepts, have a bit of fun along the way, and make connections with fellow students. To date, nearly 2,000 people have enrolled into this course, so there's a fantastic community around it. So be sure to explore the discussion forums and introduce yourself there as well. Many students participate there even if they can't attend the live sessions. So Lil is also with us tonight, is an administrative and technical support role for IT Masters, so she'll be monitoring the chat and assisting with any access or support related questions. Lil also manages the learn.itmasters.edu.au platform, and you'll find all the course materials, as well as including reading discussion, forums, as well as quizzes. So if you have any questions tonight or later, please don't hesitate to contact us using the details provided on that site. This week, I'd like to also mention that we have a course satisfaction survey available on the learn.itmasters.edu.au course site. So you'll find it right at the bottom of that menu, and we really appreciate it if you can take the minute to complete it either this week or next. And your feedback is extremely valuable in helping us to improve further courses or future courses to ensure we're delivering the kind of learning experience we're looking for. Now, please say good day in the chat. Welcome, George, and let us know where you're joining from while everyone settles in. We'll give it a couple of minutes. Feel free to answer the poll or drop down the message at the end of the chat during the webinar or at the end. So normally, I like to leave you all to chat amongst yourselves while we wait, but tonight I also like to remind you about a current special offer that we're providing. And to celebrate the launch of the SCC AI certification, we are offering 25% off all CompTIA products in the ITM store until the end of May. So we're currently offering around 12 to 15 certifications and their associated courses through the store. And we can also source additional products if there's something specific you're looking for. So if you don't see what you need, simply complete this discount request form and include a note about the certification or product you're after. So to receive your discount coupon code, fill out the form via that store or email us at shortcourses@itmasters.edu.au. I'll say that again, shortcourses@itmasters.edu.au, and we'll send the code through for use at checkout. And other than that, looks like we're about to ready to go. So please join me in welcoming George as we kick off things for tonight's session. George, it's all yours.
Thanks, Terry. Just there I am. All right. Welcome back, everyone, to week 4 of 4. So this will be our last webinar. So thanks for coming along. And I'll get into it. So tonight we are going to talk about AI governance, risk, and compliance. So, oops, see that always happens to me. I click the button and nothing happens. There we go. So week 1 was really basic AI concepts in relation to cyber. So obviously very focused on cyber. Week two, we looked at securing AI systems, so some of the, controls and I guess processes around, like threat modeling and so forth, around securing AI systems in an organization. Week three, we kind of flipped it around and looked at AI assisted security, so how AI tools can be used for cybersecurity purposes, both defensive and offensive, which then double-edged sword can be used for non like I suppose malicious and non-malicious purposes, but obviously using AI to perform those tasks. And today takes us to the end and the GRC piece. So that's where we are. So we're kind of look, I'm going to basically split this into a few different bits. I'm going to talk about kind of organizational governance structures for AI, look at some of the risks associated with AI. And I know it's sort of been dotted throughout, so maybe a little bit this will kind of reinforce some of the prior learnings. And then look at some of the compliance specific pieces and things like standards and frameworks, and we'll touch on those. So let's just get into it. I have this kind of habit of thinking I'm going to run under and I end up running over. So I'm just going to keep moving. And then I start to rush and talk really fast. Um, right. So establishing AI governance. So, look, I think the first thing here is around, things like, and we talk about governance, we talk about policies and procedures. So it's really that overarching, yeah, that governing, but that overarching program effectively that, that's required or, useful in, um, making sure that AI is controlled and that, it's going to be secure and, going to be used ethically and maintaining accuracy and all that sort of stuff. So in that, there's a few different elements that we will cover off. Um, the AI Center of Excellence. And so the text, if you've had a chance to pick up the text, we'll talk about the AI Center of Excellence, or the COE. We'll talk about AI policy, very important, AI procedures and what those are, and then talk about the technical guardrails to support governance. And so we've talked about guardrails in a few instances before, and we've talked about guardrails almost from a the perspective of enforcing rules within AI models and things like that. And this is putting it in the context of supporting governance. And then we'll look at some of those AI governance, risk, and compliance programs. And as I say, that's probably where I'll lean a little bit more into some of the standards, frameworks, maybe a little bit of the legislation that's out there. And yeah, we'll touch on that. So when we talk about AI Center of Excellence, what this really is it's a I guess if I kind of describe it simply, it's basically a centralized team um, of people. And the key thing here, and sorry, it's very tiny over here. I'm looking at my preview and I keep looking over there because it's a bit bigger. Well, so the important thing here was how bullet three talks about blending AI engineering, data science, and information security. So when I say a centralized team, it's a team that will provide things like best practices, resources, and strategic guidance for the organization for AI projects. But it's really important to make sure that it's cross-functional and that it's not just getting delivered from, one function. And so, in order to do that and to do that effectively, it needs to blend engineering and data science and legal, privacy, if that's separate, information security, risk management, procurement, product management. There should be, I guess, representatives from each of those teams that form part of this center of excellence. And again, if you look at some of the benefits of that, so from again, from the resource material, one, it becomes a coordination hub, creates a unified vision so that everyone's, kind of singing the same song. It's standardized practices so that you just don't have a whole bunch of different things and different uses of AI and practices going across an organization. It formalizes those external collaborations, it fosters talent and it fosters talent development. So, really it's about standardizing decisions and reducing, duplicated work and, duplicated work. So, one thing when we talk about GRC or we talk about compliance is there's often perception, a misconception. Well, it is a perception and a misconception that it's going to slow things down because you're doing all these things. You've got all these policies and processes and things that and the like reviewing projects and so forth that need to happen. But what it actually does do is it creates an environment that has less issues, less duplication, better standardization, and then obviously less risk. So yeah, so that's where the COE comes from. Um, Again, very important AI policy, just like when I talk about, information security, cybersecurity at that sort of very top layer, at that higher level, probably what I'm looking for. You've got an information security policy. Similarly with AI, you should have an AI policy. And the AI policy, that will, I guess, they're like directives, to describe what is allowed. And when I say, you know, what is allowed. So what you can do, basically, what you can't do. You'll see often statements like, not thou shall, but shall and should are usually very common terms within a policy. Um, there'll also be things like what evidence is needed. So, for example, for supporting audits, then the policy would have a directive like trying to think of an example. Uh, I'll just use DAO, but the organization shall maintain a register of data assets. There you go. And so having that register is something that the policy says that you will do, and then that can be used to support it in the event that an auditor comes in. So say, for example, and we will get to standards and frameworks, but say the organization wants to get ISO IEC 42001, then they need to provide some evidence for various things within that standard, and so that would be something that would be a directive out of the AI policy. It also will describe things around authority. So who can make decisions? And that could even, and that's everything from who will generally make decisions to if there is exceptions. So if there is an exception to a rule, who is authorized to do that? So those are the types of things that you will see in that policy. Policies aren't going to have detail. They're not going to tell you how to do things. They're just going to be very, very high level requirements or directives, as I mentioned. Um, on the right there, you could see some typical AI policy, almost like clauses. I call them clauses, but so purpose and scope. So what is the purpose and scope of the policy? So what is the whole point of this thing? Um, and then you've got, the roles and accountability that I kind of just said. So who is responsible, who is accountable? Obviously, again, we're going to get into like the different elements um, and the principles around, responsible AI use, and you're going to see, words like accountability and transparency, all those sorts, and human oversight come up. Again, things like data use, human oversight, security. Again, so I'm doing that thing where I'm just kind of going through them, but privacy and then incident response. So in the event that something goes pear-shaped, what is the uh, not the incident response plan. This is a policy. So again, this will say something along the lines of, and not verbatim, but thou shalt have an incident response plan to, respond to detect and respond to incidents in a, you know, timely fashion sort of thing and all that. Probably very poor policy statement, but you kind of get what I mean. So this is about requirements and about, directives. One of the key things, and when I say this isn't about kind of getting deep into the weeds when we talk about policies, and trust me, I've seen policies just that are absolutely ginormous, like hundreds of pages. Not really useful, very hard to digest. So best practice for policies is that, think about it being short. When I say short, short enough to read in one sitting. So you can just sit down, read it, but it needs to be clear. and then it needs to support enforcement. So you have to make sure that there's no ambiguity in there. And as I said, those statements like shall are very directive. And I say you will do this, right? That's what a shall is, whereas a should means, well, kind of sounds optional to me already. Um, but yeah, just a few things around policies. If we then kind of go into procedures, this is where it starts to go into a little bit more depth. And what it is it's really about kind of almost the how to, right? So when I think about a policy, that's the kind of, what we will do, what the requirements are. And then, if you go into procedures, it's the like, how do we go and do this? So one will say, you know, sorry, I keep saying thou shall, but thou shall do periodic access reviews of an AI system, or thou shall do quality checks, right, on the output. Whereas the procedure will provide the process for doing those checks. And the idea is that by having it in a procedure, it will be consistent. It'll be done the same every time and not just going to be, kind of random ad hoc, right? So it's about having that repeatable kind of process. The procedure will also cover who does it, when they do it, that sort of thing. And again, it should be easy to follow. The idea, and I always use this when I talk to, clients about ISO and those sorts of things, is imagine that you have to give that to somebody that isn't, what's the word, familiar with the process. They need to be able to follow it and do it in the same way that it's always, that it's done as per the procedure. So that's and that for me is also how I determine whether a procedure is required or not. If it's something that that a person will be able to just work out pretty quickly, or that's just obvious, then maybe a procedure is not as required. Whereas for more complex things, procedures are almost absolutely required. Um, so procedures. And then we've got technical guardrails. So this is about enforcing that compliance with the AI governance in day-to-day ops, right? So things like model and prompt registries, versioning, access controls based on least privilege, secrets management, quality checks, some of the security stuff like data masking, all those sorts of things will be technical guardrails to support governance. So, um, oh yeah, I'm just going to cover those off. But yeah. All right. So GRC programs or AI GRC programs. Now, it's an interesting one because I think a lot of, again, a common misconception is that AI or GRC programs generally, are often thought to be like enterprise only. Um, it's thought that only the big, large corporate environments and so forth, need to follow or need to implement a GRC program. Now, I don't believe that that is true. I think there needs to be some elements of GRC programs in any environment. But what is important to understand is there's going to be different levels of maturity. And so maturity is incremental and it changes over time. So, you kind of start off with one level of maturity and improve that and evolve that over a period as the organization grows, or as time and resource permits and the requirements occur. So early on, I think at a very, very basic level, it's about having it at least an AI policy, and having some sort of inventory of how AI is used within the organization. and you could kind of see them here, but it doesn't kind of break them down. The next thing would be to establish that model registry, look at adopting an industry standard. Again, I'm not saying it, you know, needs to be the one that the enterprises are using, like we have to go like ISO or anything like that, but have a look at what's out there. Um, and then as the program evolves, start doing things like the risk management practices, um, and doing the automation and so forth. And then finally, you can see there seek independent third party validation. So when you get to the kind of very mature end, that's where the things like the external audits and the certifications and those sorts of things will start to appear. So um, yeah, the key here is that it's not a hey, we just throw a GRC and it's only for the big orgs. It is a case of start small, keep working on it, and there will be elements that do mature and expand over time. Um, cool. That's it on that. So let's look at some of the roles in AI, or the important roles in AI. Again, I mean, these may be called something else in different organizations. These are I mean, to me, these all sound pretty normal, but yeah, these are the ones from the text. So effectively, if we look at some of the roles, we have things like, we have roles like data engineers and data scientists. So it's important to kind of understand, I guess, the difference between the different roles. By the way, there's not just two, there's more of them. There's probably several slides on this. So the data engineering roles are really I guess the folks that clean, label, deliver the data. Basically, they're responsible for making sure that what goes in to the models is effectively fit for purpose. So I know that they're not just throwing garbage into the models, which is going to create all sorts of problems. Data scientists, on the other hand, are more around, well, their role is to define the problem. So explore the data, define the problem. It says here, select relevant features, and then develop baseline models to demonstrate value. So a bit higher level than the data engineer. So they're kind of looking at the data and understanding it, whereas the engineer is more around, preparing the data, getting it ready, and that sort of thing. We have machine learning engineers. So, they'll take things like prototypes and transform them into production grade models, opposed to an architect. So, an architect, again, if you're familiar with, solution architecture and system architecture and enterprise architecture, yes, all these architecture terms, titles, roles. Basically, this is kind of looking at it from that bigger picture. How do these components fit together? How do they fit within the enterprise of the organization, and those sorts of things. So they have that very broad view. I mean, those architecture decisions are going to do things like affect logging, isolation. They're going to affect things like compliance as well. So, it requires a pretty broad knowledge of not only the technology, but how it fits within the business. So, yeah, AI architect, um, platform engineer. I mean, basically, this is the underlying infrastructure. So this is the platform engineer. Sometimes they're a systems engineer, but basically they will provide that infrastructure that's used to experiment and deploy. So that's the underlying stuff. And then you've got the ML ops engineer. And so, this is about, again, managing versioning and lineage. So, where does the data come from? Can you trace the data back to its origin? Those sorts of things are very important from an integrity perspective. Looking at monitoring for things like drift and so forth. Um, and so monitoring and rollback, they're about detecting and correcting risk. So it's not just something for convenience. Um, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Um, there's still almost there. There's only four more. So AI governance engineer. So here, as you could see, managing deployment risks, collecting evidence. This is really about now starting to move into the governance space, but again, very technical resource that's, responsible for those particular things. So, they're going to be able to get into the AI systems and collect that evidence and prepare it, obviously for auditors and so forth. They're going to do things like enforce retention and audit requirements in line with any policies that may have been created for the purposes of, well, and sorry, I talk about AI policy, but many organizations will also have like data policies or data retention policies and things like that. A lot of those are going to be driven out of like legal and so forth, because depending on jurisdiction, there may be a requirement to keep something for a minimum amount of time or for a maximum amount of time. Um, so, that will usually be a requirement because it is data that we are dealing with. And so those requirements would be something that the AI governance engineer would be required to enforce. AI risk analyst. So basically, as you can see here, assesses use cases and systems based on legal, ethical, and business risk. Um, Again, making sure that treatments are in there, that they're consistent, um, and yeah, basically emphasize that consistency over enforcement, and blocking and so forth. And then last two, we have the AI auditor. Now, typically, this could be an internal person, or it could be an external, depending. I mean, a lot of organizations will engage, external consulting firms to do this, but again, depends on the organization and the requirements. But effectively, there's an element when we talk about auditing about independence. Independence is really, really important. I think as well, if you think about doing this, what's the word? Adequately, responsibly, ethically. You need to look for any conflicts of interest. So, for example, you probably wouldn't have the auditor reporting in the same reporting line as the people that are responsible for the system. For example, it would be some, as I said, an internal audit department or an external auditor would be the best, what's the word, option for that. And what they'll do is, they will verify things, they'll look at the evidence, and they'll make sure that there's compliance with the policy. So, I mean, I don't know, I've lost count how many audits I've done. But effectively, I will look through policies and artifacts and I'll build an audit plan up and then I'll go, meet with people, review systems, look at the evidence, and then basically provide a finding whether they, conform or don't conform or whether there's any opportunities for improvement and things like that. But basically, that's what the AI auditor does. If we look at the AI security architect, this is really that role that helps to protect the AI, and all those things that we've been talking about. So really, this particular introduction course really focuses probably more so on this role than anything. So looking at data protection model, protecting models and so forth from threats, making sure that safeguards and access controls and any other controls to protect the AI are in place, and doing any testing, whether that be routine testing or whatnot, or coordinating that. All right. So risks associated with AI. As I said, we've talked a little bit about this throughout the last 3 weeks. So there's probably a little bit of repetitive content, not too much. But one thing that I do like about this is looking at the principles of responsible AI. So again, for anyone that's had the chance to look at I think it was October last year, the AI ethics course that I ran, you'll notice that there's probably, and you will see a little bit more, you'll notice there's a bit of overlap here in terms of what has come from the SecAI Plus, as well as overlap with things like which is probably where they're from anyway, OECD's AI principles, which I'll get into in a moment. Even if, if you're in Australia, which many of us are, the Voluntary AI Safety Standard, VISS from the Australian government, you see again a bit of overlap here. So this is really about, and we'll get into these in a bit more detail in a moment, but these looking at AI risk, these are the areas that, we kind of look at and what the risks are related to these areas. So let's get into that. And I think one thing I should also mention is, this isn't like abstract kind of ethics. This is really about decision making and things like that. So let's look at responsible AI use. So basically, when we talk about responsible AI use, it's about values, it's about expectations. And when designing AI, making sure that those, I guess, values and expectations are built into the AI. So, what would, and it's going to vary depending on, factors like, cultural expectations and legal expectations and things like that. One of the things I always talk about when working in the ISO space, whether it be 27 or 42,001, or it could even be, 9,000 and so forth, because it's up in clause 4. By the way, it kind of starts at clause 4, but so it's first clause, basically the first one that you kind of have to really do the work in. But looking at, interested parties and so forth and what their needs and expectations are. And I think that really aligns with this. So it's about understanding who's involved, whether it be your customers, whether it be regulators, whether it be who knows, stakeholders within the business. But, what are their values? What do they expect? And about instilling fairness as well within that. So making those decisions and making sure that the use of the AI is responsible. There's always this thing that I've, used a few times and we talk about a lot in the privacy space. And sorry, 27701 is another one. But just because you what's the word? Just because you can, should you? Right? So sometimes even if, there's a legal, nothing that says legally you can't do something, I think again, when we think about responsible use and ethical use, should you do it? So those are the things that you need to, I guess, consider when talking about responsible use of AI. Um, Accountability. So, who is responsible for decisions and AI systems? Ultimately, the AI can't be responsible for it. So, if it makes a poor decision and something really bad happens, you can't just finger point at the, well, I mean, I'm could try, but ultimately, you can't finger point at the machine and say, oh, yeah, the machine made a poor decision. So, it's the machine's fault. Somebody's responsible for that. And that's why, if we tie it back to the AI policy, at the start and talking about the roles and responsibilities and documenting them in there, that's where this is really important. And so that's ultimately, and look, at the end of the day, it probably will funnel away up to senior stakeholders like the board and so forth being responsible. But yeah, it needs to be implemented. So who is responsible for what, basically? Um, cool. And we've got transparency and explicability. Basically, this is the piece around being transparent about the use and how it's used and, why, how an output is made. So basically, not being a complete black box is kind of what I'm getting at. Um, so yeah, transparency. I feel like that should be like explainability, to be honest, but um, is important. And again, this is something that you'll see in the OECD AI principles, and you'll see it in some of the others as well. Um, Privacy and data governance, really, really important. Obviously everyone has the right to privacy. And so, when, these systems rely on, big data, so they're bringing in, terabytes, petabytes of data, that privacy needs to be, maintained and protected and basically, again, talking about responsible use and the expectations, that is part of it, but also making sure that, there's compliance with things like privacy laws. So here, Privacy Act 1988, if you're in the EU or dealing with EU persons, then, there's GDPR. There's Pepita, there's heaps of them. In the US, there's multiple. So depending on what state you're in, it could be the CCPA for California. Or there's just like, and so thinking about that, you need to again understand who the stakeholders are. So who are your audience and what laws do you need to comply with? So there's that as well. And then that's going to require controls to maintain that privacy. And that's going to be a combination of privacy controls and processes as well as security ones. Also, you'll see here things like, minimal, so data minimization, so only collect what you need to, get rid of it when you no longer need it, all those sorts of things. So, and that's, understanding the data is really important. Human oversight. So having a human in the loop, and we talk about this a bit. Um, Basically, it's the quality assurance piece, but it's also the sanity check. Making sure that that is in place, making sure that the procedures that you've developed account for that. So when there's, especially when there's critical decisions to be made, and if you look at something like the EU's AI Act, and even if you look at GDPR, although it does prohibit a lot of this stuff. But when we talk about decisions that are like automated decision making, um, but where AI is making I guess a critical decision or a high risk decision, it should be vetted, right? There needs to be some sort of oversight. Don't just go let it run. As I said, even when I use it for not doing anything like that, I don't just let it go willy-nilly, go do what it needs to. I'll sit there and review what it's going to do. So it'll go, oh, I want to edit this file. Is that okay? And I'll read and I'll go, okay, well, we wants to edit lines, 300, 301, and 302. What's that? Oh, okay, that's in that. Yep, no, that looks fine. Okay, yes. Or no, that doesn't look good. No. So, having someone there, and I mean, look, yeah, it absolutely creates efficiencies, but I'm not just going to blindly trust it. Um, and then sustainability and social impact, that one comes up a bit. But what's the broader usage of AI? I'm not going to get into workforces and things like that, but what impact does that have on society, and having considerations around that. Um, we also have consistency. So, is the output consistent? Basically, depending on who the audience are, is it creating, so bias is a potential risk here. So is it being biased for some reason? And we have seen examples of where the AI has created or has resulted in biases, which is not ideal, that have to be addressed. But basically making sure that the outputs are consistent, that they're fair and equal. Cool. All right. I might pause there for a second because I need some water. Hang on.
George, while you pause, I'm just going to bring this up with everyone. I know we're sort of, I do believe at the halfway mark. Is that correct, George? Sorry to bring this up. Yep. Okay. So yeah, what we're going to do now, everyone, we're going to put in a survey into the chat. We would love to hear from each and every one of you in regards to this course. Obviously, like I was saying before, we like to improve a lot of things that we are putting forward on behalf of Charles Sturt University. But also, there is going to be a link that is going to be provided in the chat from Lily about another webinar that's happening on the 13th of May at 7 p.m. So this is obviously going to be the you have get the chance to meet the original director called Zach Harvey for CompTIA, and obviously Shane Murphy from ITM, which is us, IT Masters, and is obviously understanding a lot more about this. So obviously why industry certs make good career and financial sense, and how industry credits work in reducing your master study time, but as well as obviously why it's now a great time to prepare for your masters. So there, a link will be provided to you for you to sign up. So again, 13th of May at 7 p.m. Please join Zach Harvey as well as Shane in regards to the CompTIA. So yeah, I do believe Lily has put that up for everyone, which is fantastic. And she will most likely put the survey up as well. So if you do see it, do have a read of it, and we'll take it from there.
Cool. All right. And so to answer your question, we are at 20 or 45, but I think the last three are just fluff anyway. So,
Hmm.
um, as in one that says questions and one with references sort of thing.
Yep.
Um, so, where was I? Thank you. Right. So identifying risks unique to AI. So again, context to AI. We're going to look at some of the risks that are kind of high level and then look at some high level mitigation strategies to deal with that. So training data, historical inequities or case omission. So this can result in a reproduction of errors. And here, the mitigation is to conduct systematic data profiling and use synthetic data to fill gaps. So what that basically means is that, using synthetic data and evaluating the models on real world distributions and not just relying on easily collecting anything. It's about having a kind of structured approach to that was weird. To examining, kind of analyzing the data sources, making sure that there's quality. So this goes to, the quality piece again, to making sure that it's quality data, that it's structured properly. It goes back to that data engineering role. So that I can't remember what it was, but the data engineering role that was mentioned, to identify if there's any anomalies and things like that, if there's any inaccuracies. Basically, it's the thing that I said a couple of weeks ago about, might have even been last week, about there's the garbage in, garbage out. It's about trying to mitigate that. Sorry, I might just there we go. Um, Trying to mitigate that risk. Um, we also have distribution shift and model drift. So this is where we've got a mismatch between production data and training data when the world changes. So, for example, if you look at a model that is forecasting demand, that's trained on data before, let's say, a new competitor enters the market, then it can become less accurate when that occurs. So this is where monitoring systems need to be implemented to really compare those inputs and outputs against those baselines, and then also look at things like retraining and so forth. And yeah. So we have complex models. So complex models. So this is really like the deep neural stuff. Um, they can, they're often very high in accuracy, but they do become difficult to interpret. Um, and so this is where we look at things like feature importance analysis, model documentation. So this is really about enhancing the visibility of what's going on. If we look at environments that may be regulated, for example, maybe opting for a simpler, more interpretable model that delivers comparable performance might be a better option than having a really complex model, because the complex model, while it's going to be probably very accurate, it could be difficult to interpret and to kind of kind of get your head around it. So yeah, and that kind of creates issues with a thing like transparency and explainability and or whatever the other word was that they used, explicability or whatever it was. Um, Data poisoning, we've talked about this one a little bit as well, but basically this is where I guess a threat actor might push a model towards a certain behavior. So they might poison the data, so to feed it, dodgy data for the purpose of shifting it to think that what's coming in is normal. And then, as I said, this can happen a lot with obviously with it can happen with security models and things like that, but not exclusively. It can happen with kind of anything. But here, this is where looking at data integrity checks and evaluation and so forth can help with that. There are tools that can help do this as well, so you're not expected to go through this kind of manually. But I think who makes one? I think Informatica, which is a kind of enterprise data tool have some of these capabilities to do these integrity checks and so forth. And I think Amazon might have DQ. Is it DQ? That might be another one that can help with this. Um, hmm. We also have hallucinations, fabrications. Text calls them hallucinations, so we'll go with that. But basically, and there's been again a lot of examples of where this has happened. It kind of goes back to that whole making sure that you validate the outputs. But there's been certainly cases where even so there's a few examples of what was the one with the lawyer that came into the courtroom that cited all these precedents, and the judge was like, "What are you talking about?" And they ended up found out they used AI and it just made stuff up. Um, so, and that's why it says here, model generates plausible yet incorrect statements. So it sounds very convincing and very authoritative, but it's actually just rubbish. Um, so here, things like source grounding, retrieval augmented generation or RAG, you've probably heard the term RAG, output verification, that's what I was saying before, verification, the quality assurance piece is really important. Both source grounding and RAG will be are focused around using external sources as part of the output. So for LLMs, if you look at source grounding, what it's going to do is it will force the model to use external documents. When I say external, as an external to the model, that have been verified as part of its output. So not just using what it's trained on internally, it'll actually reference stuff that's outside in specific documents. RAG is very similar, so it'll just use external data that is again trusted. So it's using trusted data sources as part of its generation. So it's not just kind of working it out on its own based on the information it has. It has references to supplement that. And then once that's all done, as I said, using output verification steps and having a procedure for that would be how you can mitigate, some of these particular issues. But as I said, there's been quite a few examples of, legal or legal things that have gone a bit pear-shaped as a result of this. Um, cool. So versioning and data provenance risks. So again, this is where we're talking about models that have been updated by external providers or community data sets where they've been updated and you don't know they've been updated. So that could be a bit of a problem because then the output may not be what was expected or it may be wrong. You can see here strong governance, signed artifacts, and internal validation checks. Basically, what's happening here is when things change and you can't see that they've changed because they've come from an outside influence, it creates a bit of a black box scenario. So here it's really about, he has said the governance piece here, and making sure that the data is validated. If you're, consuming models that have been updated by external providers or community community data sets. Um, yeah, AI overtrust. This is what I was saying before. Like you got to validate and you got to, what's the word? Verify. You got to verify. So if you just go, yeah, no, it's fine. The AI is good. Basically saying it's brilliant and it's just let it do its thing. That's potentially going to be fraught with danger. So use training, safeguards, those sorts of things. I think the human factor here is really, really important. You don't just let the machine go off and do its own thing. You have to train it and so forth. So, yeah. So, putting principles into place. So who approves these deployments? So this is a decision, right? So when a new AI goes in, what is the process, And yeah, I get it. In the early days, it was like everyone just signed up to everything and off they went and started putting things in they weren't supposed to. Yeah, well, I mean, yes, I've always said the horse is bolted. But we're trying to bring it back in, and that's what we're doing here, right? So, who approves the deployment? What is the process? What is the policy? And then, who monitors that? It's about the roles and responsibilities piece here, so that needs to be defined. This is really big on the governance piece. Documentation, again, really important. So, where's the data coming from? What are the limitations, those sorts of things. Who are the users that are, allowed to consume, the data, all these sorts of things need to be covered. But yeah, documentation is really, really important. Otherwise, you just don't know, right? Extensive testing before release. So again, stress tests, red teaming, so security testing, fairness checks. So again, more quality assurance type stuff. Is the output what is expected? Of, fed in two different data sets, has there been any bias? All that sort of stuff. And then obviously the monitoring piece afterwards. So, has there been any errors, any things that can indicate there's been sort of drift of the model, and so forth. And then you can see here any business metrics, so complaint volume and appeal rate. So if you've got AI that's being used, for example, for customer facing things, and it's coding decisions, are people complaining, those sorts of things. So you know, think about, what sort of metrics need to be happening after deployment. Um, and then also, the incident response piece. So ultimately, someone's probably going to end up with an incident at some point. It is just like any other incident, but obviously it's in the context of AI. So how do you triage that? Who needs to know that it's happened? The typical call trees type of stuff. What are the corrective actions? Does it need to be patched? Does the model need to be retrained? Are the guardrails too loose, so they need to be, tightened or changed in some way? All these sorts of things need to be considered. Um, we have AI writing assistants. So, things like, and I think I've heard a lot of people love these, Copilot in Outlook and so forth. Yeah, they're a tool that people love and they use, but again, um, you know, there needs to be some sort of monitoring and compliance in place. Controls need to be in place and those sorts of things. I feel like there's a bit of a random slide in here, but yeah, think about what they do well, think about what they fail to do, think about what they have access to. So we have some common AI risks, bias and unfair outcomes. So again, as I said this before, if you look at training data and the data that went in, and look at the who was it for Amazon? There was like an Amazon hiring, and I talked about it in the last webinar. I think it was a Amazon. I think well, can't remember. One of them. They had like they used AI to help like screen resumes. And by the way, I mean, obviously there's AI out there now that, it was that does that, but it ended up with a lot, and I won't get into it, but it ended up with a huge kind of bias and unfair outcome risk that was realized. And so, and again, it's based on the data that gets fed in, which is why it's really important to make sure that what goes into the model, is not going to result in those situations. So, yeah, very, very common. Accidental data leakage and privacy exposure. As I said, the privacy piece is really important. The data leakage thing, again, that was definitely a Samsung. Where, not having appropriate governance and controls in place results in, potentially uncontrolled use of data, whether it be the ability to feed it in or it getting trained in a model and then getting spat out. But here, this is where things like data minimization, so only collecting what you need to and inputting only what you need to, access controls, encryption, different environments. So when I say separate different environments, dev test prod type stuff. So, typically, again, if we look at an ISO control, you don't put production data into test dev environments. You use like, sanitized, anonymized type data. But yeah, same principles still apply. But yeah, look, prompts themselves can contain sensitive information, and that needs to be treated accordingly. And as I said, that might be through the use of, guardrails and so forth, and data masking to get rid of to clean that data before it goes in. Reputational harm and stakeholder trust. So it could be offensive, inaccurate. I mean, yes, there was the whole Microsoft one, the Twitter slash X thing a little while ago. But making sure that values and product behavior and those sorts of things, because reputational damage can escalate pretty quickly once the outputs are public. And here again, we look at things like, yes, reputation risk governance, but that human in the loop, incident playbooks and how to deal with that. So yeah, we're almost. Oh yeah, got the compliance frameworks coming. Um, Risks from autonomy in real world actions. So unanticipated side effects. I mean, that's probably inevitable. Um, AI systems, whoops, AI systems are, often given that ability to act, schedule tasks, make purchases. They can control physical devices. Um, and then, that autonomy can increase impact, even when the intent, is benign. So, there should always be, especially for those high impact actions, there should always be some human validation and the ability to reverse. Unclear goals are often a common root cause of unsafe autonomous behavior as well. So just keep those things in mind. All right. So, and by the way, yeah, I've stolen a couple of these following slides from my previous deck. I'm not going to get into it in a huge amount of detail, because if you want to learn more on what's about to come up, I mean, you could just go and look at the AI ethics course. I think week 3 or 2, maybe week 2, has a lot of this in there, but it's a good overview anyway. So the last piece is going to be on standards and frameworks. This is not exhaustive. These are just a few of the most, I guess, not common, well-known, that's the word I'm looking for. Well-known standards, frameworks, regulations around the world. But again, as I said, not exhaustive. So we're going to look at ISO, OECD, NIST, and then from a regulatory perspective, we'll look at the EU. There's also some other responsible AI frameworks from industry. I think Microsoft, Google, IBM have one. I've tried to keep this fairly neutral. So ISO, OECD, and NIST are, not vendor based. So if we look at ISO, so ISO IEC 42001:2023 is its full name. This is really the first international standard designed for specifically managing artificial intelligence. And it basically, as the name suggests here, it says, I mean, it's a pretty long name, but Artificial Intelligence Management System, or an AIMS. So anyone that's familiar with 27001, you probably know that as an ISMS, so Information Security Management System. Anyone that's done the privacy one, PIMS, Privacy Information Management System. So, by the same standard, AIMS, Artificial Intelligence Management System. And the kind of, I guess, purpose of this is to help with developing, deploying, and using AI systems, and doing that responsibly, ethically, and transparently. So it's been around, as I said, for probably about 3 years now. It follows the same high-level structure as do the other standards. So 42,000, no, sorry, this is 40,000, 27,000, 9,001, all those. It has annexes, as do the others. But one key thing with ISO IEC 42001 is that it is certifiable. So you can get an external auditor, so whoever, BSI, SAI, SGS, whoever, to do an audit of your AIMS. And once you pass, you get the certification certificate. Like all the like 20, sorry, not like all, like 27,001 and 9,001, it follows the Plan, Do, Check, Act PDCA life cycle. and as I said, we won't get into that, but it's a yeah, that's that's ISO. Now, OECD, can't remember for the life of me what it stands for. Is it down there somewhere? No. But basically, this is like for trustworthy AI. So these are really five core principles, and I do have a table coming. These are five core principles for trustworthy AI, and you'll see, as I said, some of these look very, very familiar. Um, Talking about, inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. So really, it's saying here that AI should benefit people, it should benefit the planet, promote human-centered outcomes, support environmental sustainability. So that's really what that first one's about. The second one, human-centered values and fairness. So this is about respecting laws, human rights, democratic values. It doesn't, this second, I guess, principle of the five is the one that includes privacy, fairness, freedom of bias, and no discrimination and things like that. Think, yeah, someone popped it up there. Transparency and explainability. So making sure that the systems are transparent and that they provide, meaningful information about limitations and how they make decisions. Um, Robustness, security, and safety. So they should be secure and safe, basically managing any kind of risks, and even things like unintended consequences that I talked about before. Yeah, that's something that should be, in that principle there. And then accountability, very important one, which is that, someone needs to be accountable. There needs to be accountability. There needs to be oversight. It's not just the machine did it. It's its fault. Yeah. We have NIST, so National Institute of Standards and Technology. So they've been around for a long time. It's a US government department. I think it's, yeah, part of the Department of Commerce. Um, they have the AI risk management framework. It is voluntary. It is technology neutral. It is free. Actually, I know ISO isn't. You pay for that one. I can't remember about the OECD one. I think that is free as well. But NIST, again, many people are familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, but the AI RMF is the AI one. Again, it supports that trustworthy AI. It's designed to align with the existing standards, align with any regulatory efforts. It follows this govern, map, measure, manage. They tend to do that with NIST, have the kind of principles. And yeah, that basically governs about establishing the oversight, the policies, those sorts of things, roles and responsibilities, all that sort of stuff we talked about before, sits within that govern. And then on the outside, you've got MAP. So MAP is looking at the AI system's use, the stakeholders that use it, the risks, the technical, ethical bits and pieces, data sources and models. Measure is about quantifying and assessing that using a particular criteria, looking at things like performance and so forth. And then manage is about the controls and monitoring and responding to incidents and things like that. But this one is, again, it is US based, but I mean NIST has been used across the globe for, you know, it's free. It's not certifiable, but yeah, it's definitely a good one to look at. If I look at some of the regulatory stuff, and look, the EU was again, at the forefront there, came into force August 2024, but they were the first piece of AI or comprehensive AI regulation in the world. They use a risk-based approach, and what they do is they kind of classify these risk levels. So that's what you could see from top to bottom. So the Act categorizes AI systems into those one of those four, and they have different regulatory obligations. So the systems up the top that are red, which are classified as high risk, or sorry, unacceptable risk, my bad, unacceptable risk are just banned outright. So things like that, AI is used to manipulate or do subliminal techniques, or if they're exploiting vulnerabilities, whether that be age, disability, or distorting behavior, those types of systems are just banned. So you can't, not allowed. High risk systems, which says must comply with stringent requirements, those are heavily regulated. So things that deal with credit scoring, biometric identification, things used by, education, law enforcement, employment, healthcare. Those are high risk systems. So there's going to be very strict controls in order to use those AI systems. Low risk systems, they must comply with transparency requirements. So these are things like chatbots, deepfakes, all those sorts of things. They must inform the users that they are interacting with AI. Yeah, I know. You look now at stuff, it's like, is that AI? Well, in the EU, you must be informed that it is actually AI. And then you get the no risk stuff. So spam filters, AI in video games, and things like that. I mean, they're pretty much unregulated. There's not really any controls required there. So yeah, and I do have, I'm not going to go through this at all, but it is in the deck. There's a bit of a side-by-side comparison of these particular different standards and regulations and how they work. So you could see here, scope, so global policy level, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, AI systems in the EU market, whether it's binding or voluntary, those sorts of things. So definitely take a look at that. It's 2 pages of that. And that's it. That is the end. Um, Click.
All right, thank you so much for that, George. Really appreciate that. We've got about 4 questions on here. We'll start with Steve. I expect that chain of custody becomes more complex when actors are bots or AI agents rather than humans. Even within a single organization who is legally accountable become more difficult, i.e. tech manager, product manager, CIO, CSO, legals. That's not more of a question, it's more of a statement, yeah? Or
Well, it's got question marks.
oh,
So do you mean in the context of like if you're collecting evidence and that sort of thing, or
mm,
um, look, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, because if you've got, and I think this is where accountability and responsibility will come in. Because yes, it does get complicated when you've basically got things that are not actually humans and maintaining chain of custody.
mhm,
I haven't really had much to do with that, to be honest. But I feel like that is a bit of a tricky one. But I think if someone is ultimately,
mhm,
yeah, responsible for it, been to see what other people think on that. But I haven't had a lot to do with that. And in the sort of forensic sense,
mhm.
unless that is what we're talking about. But
Yeah, okay. Um, I've got Adam. So these roles you mentioned, AI data engineer, AI architect, basically the same traditional roles and people doing them with AI training and extra knowledge, and does that make the roles any more difficult or complex?
um, look, it can be. Oh man, they go away really quick. Hang on.
Oh,
That's all right. I can.
sorry. No, it's an automatic thing. I'm so
Oh,
sorry.
no,
That
that's
was,
okay. I found it.
yeah.
Um, So I think, look, the context is different. It could be someone that's been in a data engineer role in the past that is augmenting their skills with, the AI overlay, or it could be someone that's just completely new in that role. I guess is what I'm getting at. So there's going to be a mix of both. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if they're a data engineer in their current role and they're going to be looking more in the AI sort of context, then it would make that role a little more complex.
Mhm.
It also depends what they're doing. So yeah, I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I've got here Andrew Forrest. Hi, George. From a GRC perspective, there is a level of perpetuary information or priority information that a vendor or provider is not going to disclose. What is the best approach to establish whether they can provide model explainability in this circumstance?
That's a great question, actually. Because you're right, especially when you're dealing with those vendor provided models. So, for example, if I used a piece of security tech that had AI built into it, you know, it's going to be difficult for me to go, oh, tell me how that works.
Mm,
They're probably going to go, yeah, how about no? I think where we're kind of probably thinking more along the lines of the transparency piece is when you're setting up your own models for the purpose of making decisions for example, for your customers and things like that. I think there are absolutely going to be situations where it's not feasible, practical, permissible to get access to that. How does this thing work under the hood? Obviously, you're going to have some idea, depending again on use case, of where the data comes from that you're feeding into the model. So there might be some transparency around that. Oh, we sourced it from here, but the kind of inner workings of it might be a little bit more difficult. But certainly, if you're going to be, building your own models, I mean, it's probably pretty gathered that, um, you know, that's where you're going to have that transparency because you actually have the ability to do that.
Yeah, great. So I'll answer that one. We've got another one. Please, can you say more on the encryption for prompts for mitigating data leakage?
Yeah, look, I think that's I was looking at that one too. I think that's more like for anyone that has done any work with pets.
Hmm.
Sorry, pets, not like dogs and cats and stuff,
Mm.
and not the bottles either. But privacy enhancing technologies, like basically to when you're importing to encrypt that data from basically the moment it goes in and then having it encrypted in there so it's not just free floating around is kind of what that's, I think, alluding to. So by doing that, you're not just having unencrypted data sitting inside your data repository. That's all that is. So it's basically kind of protecting that information while it's think about the encryption in transit, at rest, in process type stuff. It's kind of that. So just making sure that that's applied at the prompt as well.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. And we've got one more from Mishi. What is your perspective on the recent events where AI has failed to stop when instructed by humans?
So this is why everyone should go and look at the AI ethics course that I ran last year with my references to Skynet and Terminator.
Yeah.
But hey, look, there was also the AI. Do you see the bot that tried to run the marathon thing? I mean, who cares?
No.
That's funny. So I feel bad for the bot. Um, but yeah, look, I think it's a little scary that that's kind of happening. That they're starting to kind of think about self-preservation and things like that. I mean, haven't we learned anything from Hollywood?
Mm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, look, I think we all probably thought that's going to happen at some point, but it is not
Mm.
really have a perspective on it, more that it's a bit of a concern more than anything.
Yeah.
That's something when you're told to shut down, basically blatantly refuses to. Um, yeah, that's a bit of a worry. I feel like in that case, what's going on? Like, is there like there should be a fail safe, right?
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair. And same question from Vishi. In continuation question from the course material, which one has failed? Governance, testing, or data?
Um, I'm gonna say probably, well, it's probably all three of them, to be honest. I mean,
Mm.
governance has failed because, there's been either it's been an oversight and it hasn't been included in there to make sure that doesn't happen, or if it is, it hasn't been implemented properly, which also means that if it has, then they haven't tested it. Like, it's hard. It's hard to look at that and say which one. I think it could be any of them, or it's been trained on data that's made it learn that. I think from a high level, governance is probably the main one. But yeah, I think once that falls down, then the rest of it just kind of follows.
Yeah. Fair. All right. I think that's it for questions. I think we've got only one more minute before we finish up. George, do you have anything else you wouldn't like to bring up before we call it?
No, again, thanks everyone for coming along for the last 4 weeks. I hope you got something useful out of it. And if you are going to, continue studying and do the SecAI Plus, then, best of luck with that
Hmm.
and, the exam. And
Hmm.
yeah, just thanks again. And
Yeah.
maybe I'll see you
Beautiful.
around. So.
No, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for George for your contributions and really helping everyone. So really appreciate that. And look, thank you so much for everyone attending. Obviously, if you have any questions, please follow those emails we've sent out to you, but also the link that Lily had provided. Again, 13th of May at 7 p.m. online with Zach Harvey and Shane Murphy to go through CompTIA. So again, thank you so much for everyone to attending and enjoy your night. Thank you very much.